Right. Good morning, my YouTube subscribers from a cloudy Lanzarote. It's not always sunny here. It is a little cloudy today. Now, I felt that I would like to make a video on the current Russia situation because I've heard a lot on LBC of people like James O'Brien just saying that the far right, oh, we're just Putin apologists, and we see Putin as some sort of daddy authoritarian figure who we want to, dance around, and this is utter nonsense. But what we are doing is we're pointing out that there's two sides to every story, and we're also pointing out that this terrible situation here isn't 100% Putin's fault. And I think Peter Hitchens said a very good quote. He said, if I tell a child not to annoy a wasp, and that child keeps annoying that wasp, and then the wasp stings the child, it doesn't put me on the side of the wasp. Now, the first thing to point out is that as white nationalists and in the patriotic right-wing movement, any war where white men kill white men is for us an utter tragedy and utter waste, and it goes against all what we are trying to achieve, and particularly one where white Slavic brothers with common ancestry, common history, common familial ties are killing each other in cold blood is an utter tragedy for us. And what I say this from the point of view that if you look on a worldwide scale, in 1900, white Europeans made up a quarter of the world, and Europe was 3 times the size of Africa. And by 2050, white Europeans will be a mere 8% of the world, and Africa will be 3 times our size. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't value anyone from other races. Of course I do. But the fact is, as a nationalist, I want to preserve my people, my culture, my civilization. And so it's a tragedy for me to see it being diminished yet further through brothers' wars. And for any normies who've blundered onto here, before they start saying all this nonsense about supremacist and Nazi and all the rest of it, let me just point out that what being a white nationalist means is that you acknowledge there are differences between races, and you just want to preserve your own race, and you want to live in a state that's around 95% of your own race, and you acknowledge that some other races, if they live amongst you on a large scale, they can be a threat to you, and it can create conflict and division. So it's not about me assuming superiority over anyone or hating someone who hasn't done anything to me. It's wanting to live in a nation that's 95% white. I mean, you're always going to have a small amount of variation, and acknowledging these racial differences. And I didn't say superiority because, we can say about IQ differences. I mean, the highest average IQ in the world, I think, is Singapore and Israel, and the lowest is Equatorial Guinea. But I wouldn't assume a person from Singapore was superior to me any more than I'd assume an individual from Equatorial Guinea was inferior to me. But obviously, if you had 100 Singaporeans and 100 Equatorial Guineans, you would know that on average the IQ in the Singaporean group would be higher than the IQ in the Equatorial Guinean group. But again, it doesn't make anyone any less valuable as a human. I mean, a brain surgeon's going to be a higher IQ person than myself, but it doesn't mean he's got more intrinsic value as a human than I have. And you know, no matter how much we say this again and again and point out this rationality, we just get shouted at and accused of being haters and Nazis and supremacists. So it's almost a waste of our breath. But we've got to keep making this point because eventually some normies might actually realise the sense that we are talking. Now, the first thing to look at with this situation in the Ukraine is history. So why you've got to think, why is it that Russia are going to be so worried about their neighbours? And obviously this isn't a new thing. This goes back a long time, that Russia did not want regimes that were hostile to it on its borders. And you go, I mean, a brilliant book I've read, the best book on Stalin, Simon Sebag Montefiore, his book on Stalin, and they were taught. It says about in this part. It says about the Yalta Conference, and Churchill and Roosevelt were trying to convince Stalin to have democratic elections in Poland, which may elect a regime hostile to him, and he just said, throughout history, Poland has served as a corridor for enemies coming to attack Russia. So Stalin, he wanted a barrier. He wanted a state, a Poland, on his borders that wasn't hostile to Russia. Now, you could say, oh, that he had cause to be paranoid in that time because he'd just been invaded. But Operation Barbarossa and what happened there doesn't stand alone in history. And if you look at it, go to the trouble of looking up some of the history, Russia has been invaded on a large scale 6 times. It was the Mongols in, I think it was 1241. There's the Poles who invaded, the Swedes invaded, Napoleon invaded in 1812. There was World War One, where the Germans invaded and actually managed to beat Russia and obtain a very good treaty against them in 1917. And there's obviously the infamous 1941 Barbarossa invasion. And that last invasion was the most brutal and the most inhumane of all. And I would go so far as it may even have been, in the words of Dutton, an evolutionary influencing event, because I mean 27 million Russians died, and so the Russians today would be the ones who were strong enough and tough enough to escape and overcome such a horror and such a tragedy and pass on their genes. So although obviously a lot of times it would just be luck, if you're in the Russian army in World War II. But I mean, I've said on previous videos about the atrocities in Russia, and I've said about how the Nazis disgustingly murdered 3 million out of the 5 million Russian prisoners of war, and they were starved and beaten to death. But it wasn't just the cities that they conquered got very little food, and the Russian prisoners of war were sort of beaten and starved to death. I mean, if you look, I mean, I think it's quite old now, but the best book about Barbarossa was Barbarossa by Alan Clark. And there's a passage in here about how after the winter of 1942-1943, the partisans had ended up in control of huge areas of Russia behind the lines. So an SS general, von den Bach-Zelewski, he just went through various areas that were suspected of containing large amounts of partisan fighters, and he systematically laid waste the villages, burnt them down in the middle of winter, and killed the inhabitants on the spot. And the atrocities were such that even other Nazis started complaining, because they said, how are we meant to get slave labour from these areas if von den Bach-Zelewski is just going through them and killing everyone? So, when you've got the extent that other Nazis are complaining, hang on, this is a little bit brutal. This is the type of war that is in the Russian history. This is the type of treatment that the Russian people have endured. And then we sit in the cosy West, where our grandfather, I mean, my grandfather was in the RAF in World War II, but they had nothing like this. That he might have had to go in, on an airfield and risk being shot at, because I mean, he was a mechanic, he wasn't a pilot. But the fact is, he knew that he wouldn't have to worry about his wife and children being massacred wholesale. And this is the war that the Russians had, and people like my granddad also knew if they were taken prisoner, they'd be fed and sheltered, whereas a Russian would be starved and beaten to death. So it's as I say, Alan Clark, Barbarossa, he was a great man, a real character. Probably wouldn't get near the Tory party selection today, because he could think independently and wasn't scared of PC. So this is the Russian history, and Russia has a reason to be cautious, to be on their guard. This is the history they've been through. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, and Putin did come to power, he did have a, for always say, open-minded approach to the West. And after 9/11, he was one of the first world leaders to call Bush and offer his sympathy. And not only that, he allowed US and British troops in Afghanistan to be supplied via Russia. And he came forward, with this sympathy and this practical support. But then he in his war against Islamic extremists in Chechnya, he suddenly found he was getting a load of criticism for human rights violations. So, as if America and Britain in their wars, they never killed any innocent civilians through bombing and such like. I mean, Mark has made the point in his video. We're talking about invasions. 200,000 innocent Iraqi civilians were killed in the invasion of Iraq to hang Saddam Hussein, one bad man. And we could talk about Libya, and we could talk about Kosovo as well. I mean, I always remember when I was watching on the news the disgusting bombing of Kosovo, seeing some poor makeup lady in the TV station, and her legs were sticking out, and she had a big pile of rubble all over her body. And I thought, what on earth has that poor woman done to deserve this? She was a makeup lady in a TV station. And I mean, if we look at the war in Kosovo, what we basically did, we stole from Serbia, a Slavic country which has ancient ties to Russia. We actually went in and stole a province that they had won in a historic battle in the Battle of the Crows, and said, oh, because a few Muslim separatists want to break away, a few Albanian Muslim terrorist separatists, we're going to bomb you until you kowtow to their agenda, and it was absolutely outrageous. I mean, these Albanian Muslim separatist fanatics. There's a country called Albania. They could have just gone south and lived there. And obviously at the time, Russia protested about this. And did the West listen? Did the West take any heed? No, not at all. And there's also the fact that we are, as well as the war crime against Serbia in 1999, NATO, which should have been ended in 1991 because it was an alliance against the Soviet Union, has crept further and further towards Russia's borders. And in 2004, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were allowed to join NATO. And that means, you know, the leading member of NATO, the USA, could and may even have weapons bases in these countries on the borders of the Soviet Union. Now, if the USSR had an alliance against America, and at the end of the Cold War, it continued that alliance as Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And today, Mexico was part of that alliance, and they wanted to put Russian troops and Russian bases in Mexico and Russian missiles in Mexico. I mean, you know, you could see the outrage that Americans would feel. And this is part of what annoys Putin. He says about how the USA is after a unipolar world where they are the big power and they dictate everything. And Barack Obama was part of this because he annoyed Putin because he dismissed Russia as a regional power. And you know, rather than accept that other countries like China and Russia are just as powerful as them, and part of this, it comes from the arrogance of the liberal globalist elites. Now we've seen in right wingers here in Britain, in America, we've seen the way these people have behaved towards us, and it's in terms of if you don't have their view on multiculturalism, if you have any criticism of Islam, if you are against the LGBT agenda and seek gay adoptions and pride parades where men perform sex acts in broad daylight, if you're against feminism and think men and women have different roles to fulfill and are suited for different jobs, then you know, you're just dismissed as and not only dismissed, your view is dismissed. People are actually persecuted. I mean, you've got Mark Collette and Laura Towler are now being denied bank accounts for their views. We've got people, you know, being thrown off social media because they've got a different view to the liberal globalist elite. We've got people like myself who get fired from their jobs just for their private views outside work. I mean, I don't know if any of you watched my previous videos. I was a policeman on the borough of Westminster from 2015 to 2020, and I lost my job because another officer found me on Facebook under a false name outside work in my own time, and I'd criticised police joining gay pride parades as narcissistic attention seeking and said the taxpayer shouldn't fund virtue signalling, and I clicked like on Traditional Britain and Britain First. And despite the fact that I'd never done anything wrong at work and I treated all members of the public exactly the same, as was my job and my duty, I was dismissed. And this is how these people are getting. They're getting to the point where they've got no toleration of any other view. And they think they can turn the entire world into this touchy-feely, over-empathetic place where there's, where they can pretend there's no such thing as racial or cultural differences between peoples, where they can have the rainbow flag in every town, where where they can have, you know, women commandos. I mean, this is what they think they can do. They think they can turn the whole world into this little touchy-feely lefty image they've got in their mind that flies in the face of all reality and all biology, and they refuse to acknowledge the possibility of any other alternative views or any other alternative ideology. And as Alex Jones says, they finally found someone who they can't bully, and this is what it's about. I mean, we've seen as right wingers in Britain, in Europe, in America, we've seen them bully us. We've seen them drive us into anonymity, where people are, hiding behind avatars, terrified to show their real identity. We've seen them chase us off social media. We've seen them deny us access to mainstream media. We've seen them sack us from our jobs. And even in the case of people who are brave enough to be prominent, like Mark, deny us bank accounts. And this is how they're carrying on. And they wanted the whole world to conform to how they thought it should be. And they finally run into someone who won't be bullied by them. And if you look, part of all this in Ukraine began. There was a coup that was probably, when the history books are written, we'll discover it had quite a lot of backing by the CIA and mainstream media. And there was a coup in which a pro-Russian government was removed in 2013, and a pro-Western government that was installed that aims to join the EU, desires to join NATO. And obviously the immediate response to this was Putin taking back Crimea, which had always been a part of Russia, as Mark points out in his recent video, and it was only gifted to Ukraine in the 60s by the Soviet Union. Now, what we get to in this is where's Putin going? And that, we've pointed out, us on the right, that Putin has been provoked, and yes, he's in the wrong now, because he's continuing a terrible war with Slavic brothers killing each other, but he's been provoked into this. And a lot of people are saying, oh, he's got some plan to refound the Soviet Union, the USSR, because they always quote the speech he made in 2005, saying the fall of the USSR was the major geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, if you look at it, what he was talking about in that speech was how ethnic Russians who've now found themselves beyond Russia's borders in places like the Baltic are being mistreated as second-class citizens and are being persecuted. And he said, and there's another quote from him that year who says, those who regret the fall of the USSR, who do not regret it, have no heart, but those who do regret it have no brain. So Putin knows that founding the USSR would be an impracticable aim today, because as well as the Baltic states and NATO, he's got to take back, I think it's five Central Asian republics that are unstable, poor, corrupt. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, places like that, places that would be a burden upon the Moscow taxpayer. So there's no great plan you know, for all he might desire the grain of Ukraine and the oil of Ukraine, he'd refound in the USSR, he'd have to take back places like Uzbekistan with all their problems and worries. So there's that, and a good book on this. I mean, it's on my Kindle, so I can't hold up the thing for you, but it's We Need to Talk About Putin: How the West Gets Him Wrong by Mark Galeotti, and he makes an interesting point about Putin. I'll have to read it from my notes because he's got a direct quote, and he says, if we persist with the idea that Putin is a strategic mastermind, we will be looking for a grand design in the chaos that simply isn't there. So what we have to look at is now is who is Putin, and I don't think he is a conviction-driven politician. I think he's very much in the Boris Johnson mode, someone who responds to events, and he has got a basic core belief in Mother Russia, and he'd like Mother Russia to be powerful, but there's no deep long-term conviction like there would be with someone like Stalin or someone like Hitler, who has an aim for 5 years ahead, an aim for 10 years ahead. I mean, this is why most of us who end up in the movement, though we're obviously passionate about politics, we'll never end up as Tory MPs in the current environment, because the conviction for us comes before any sort of careerism. And I mean, someone like Mark, if he'd have just kept his mouth shut, with his, and Laura as well, with their skills of presentation and public speaking, they could have quite easily been able to obtain status as MPs in the Tory party. But nowadays you can only do that if you are willing to stand up and say things that you know aren't true, and pay homage to the liberal agenda. And you can only do that if your career is more important than your core beliefs. And for us in the right-wing nationalist movement, this isn't the case. I mean, it's why we end up retired guys in Lanzarote talking to a YouTube or Odyssey, rather than sitting on the green benches of the House of Commons, which we would be if there was any sort of justice or sense in the way Britain was governed. Now, Putin, I think he may be someone, as a careerist, one of his motivations probably is money and wealth and splendour. And part of this is he comes from quite a poor background. He comes from a background where he grew up in the Soviet era in a shared flat, in a single room with no bath, no hot water in the flat, and it was basically poverty. And as a teenager, he went along to the local KGB office, and to try and escape this poverty, he was desperate to have a career in the KGB, and they sent him away. They said, you're too young at 17 years old, so go and get a degree or do your military service and then come back. And he went away and got a degree in law and then joined the KGB. But I mean, Putin, he's someone, he idolises Andropov, who was the legendary head of the KGB. I've not got the years written down, so I'll take a guess. I think it was 67 to 84, who later ended up, I think, as head of the Soviet Union for a brief period, Yuri Andropov. And he was very much, he was a KGB man, but he was aesthetic. He even as he went up the ranks of the KGB, he stayed in the same humble working man's flat that he'd been allocated by the Soviet system. Well, Putin isn't like this. He does have mansions. He does wear, when he does his infamous judo competitions, he does wear $2,000 tracksuits. So someone who wears $2,000 tracksuits, they are motivated by money. I mean, I think even if I was a lottery winner, I wouldn't fancy walking around a $2,000 tracksuit, because you spilt coffee on it or something. You'd be thinking, oh my God. But someone, people who are really motivated by money, they're the sort who will wear those sort of clothes, who will drive Ferraris and stuff like that as a sort of status symbol, and it's part of a symbol of how he's been successful and escaped his poor background. And what we have to look at is next is, so that's part of his motivation, is the finance, the money. And again, that isn't the motivation of someone who starts suicidal wars that could end in his own destruction for no reason. And the second uh, part of his formulation is the fact that he's from an institution, and he was in the KGB 17 years, and he's one of these people. He strikes me as sort of similar to a lot of people who I met in the police. They're 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 very much tied up in the institution, and it forms part of their whole identity and their whole persona and their pride. And often you will get people, I mean, you'll get people in various institutions like this. You'll get them in the army. I mean, I had a guy who was one of my trainers in the police, Les, and he was an ex-corporal in the army, and he always used to say to me, I've been to war twice, and he'd never shut up about the army. And obviously part of his whole identity was around being a soldier. And you get people like this in other institutions like the KGB, like the Met Police, which I was in. I mean, and part of this is that they're not primarily conviction motivated people. I mean, this is there won't be someone like me who will say things even under an anonymous name outside work. They wouldn't do that because their job, their identity in their career comes before that any conviction they might have. And I mean, part of the thing is, you see this when someone gets in trouble, they instantly distance themselves from them. And obviously I saw this in the police. I mean, I remember on my very first day going into Hendon, there was the very first person I met in the police was this girl called Rachel, who was in the queue with me going in. And I knew her. I worked with her a few times after that. And I remember once I saw her and her mum in London. She introduced me to her mum, someone I'd regard as a friend. And as soon as I was first of all placed on restricted duty, working in property. Then I was suspended. But within, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks of me being placed on restricted duty, this Rachel girl, she just blocked me on Instagram and didn't want to talk to me anymore. And uh, I mean, when you're younger, you'll be sort of upset by that. But I mean, I wasn't bothered because I knew these sort of people, their whole identity is around the institution that they're a part of, be it the police, be it the KGB. So as soon as anyone is persona non grata, they don't want anything to do with them. And with women, this will be more pronounced, particularly because, I mean, they're going against nature. Women who are in jobs like soldier, like policemen, so they're obviously always trying to prove themselves. Because when it comes to it, half the time when they're in a rut, they have to have a man rescue them. So they're going against nature. So they're doubly desperate to prove themselves. And if you look, women are more social conformist, because the women who would have lasted in prehistory were the women who managed to stay in the tribe and pass their genes on. Now, a man in the tribe in prehistory, he could get thrown out into the wilderness and he could survive. But a female thrown out the tribe in prehistory would probably just die in the wilderness. So, men who've been willing to make a stand and stand out from the crowd have passed their genes on. But women, they're very much they're adapted to the patriarchy, and they are their instinct is for social conformism, and this is why, I mean, women within our movement, like Laura Towler, people who do put themselves out there as right wingers and are willing to face social opprobrium, that makes them even more quality and more braver, because they are they they're prepared to go above that instinct for what's right. I mean, part of my admiration for Margaret Thatcher, yes, she wasn't one of us, she wasn't woke on race, but because she was a genius, I mean, I met her once, and as well as shaking my hand, she gave me a little tap on the arm. But part of what made her great, she was a genius outlier like Enoch Powell, and so the normal social conformism that a woman has, she didn't have, and this gave her a lack of empathy on the bad side, because I think Matthew Parris, the Times journalist who worked with her, said it never came naturally to her to show empathy to two people she worked with. She had to make a conscious effort to do it, and she did make the conscious effort if a secretary was ill or something like that, because it's the nice thing to do. But it didn't come naturally to her to do it, because she had the sort of semi-autistic characteristics, like Enoch Powell did, of the genius outlier, which means they don't feel that much empathy on a personal level, but on the good side, they're willing to go after what they believe is right, because they're not so obsessed with social conformism. Now, I mean, but again, it's not just the case with women. It's all people within institutions. I mean, there was another guy who was on my team, and this was a guy I quite admired, because he was an Afghan veteran, and he told me, he used to tell me stories about how he'd been in Afghanistan and used to go out on patrol, and because you couldn't take the body armour off to go to take a pee, you had to wear nappies. So you'd be walking around Afghan village with your SA-80 and your body armour on, and you'd be pissing yourself. I mean, it hardly makes soldiering quite as glamorous as you sort of see on the films. All these soldiers, in real life, the poor sod, you got so much body armour on, you have to pee in nappies. But I mean, he also told me horrible stories about, he saw some guy who was in bomb disposal, some old style major with a big old Hague style moustache, get blown up. And he said when he was blown up because he made a mistake defusing this IED Afghan bomb, his face came off of his head, and this Colin bloke had to put the face in the bag with the rest of the body, and he just sort of told it to me matter of factly. And I mean, you hear about some people get PTSD, but he just told it to me matter of factly, and I sort of quite admired that mental strength. But then when I ended up on restricted duty because of stuff I'd said outside work, he came up to me and just said, "You're a prat." Now, if he was an ex-social worker or teacher, it wouldn't have bothered me, because I'd have thought, well, they're just left-wing scum anyway, what do you expect? But I was quite disturbed by this, because I thought, well, Britain really is in trouble if people who are basically heroes who've risked their life to serve in the British Army are scared of political correctness. And I said to her, is this what you fought for in Afghanistan? A world where anyone who's got an opinion against the LGBT agenda or against multiculturalism in their own time outside of work gets sacked from their job? Is that what you fought for? That the democracy and freedom you fought for? And he just says, you shouldn't have said it, you're a prat, and just walked off. And there's no talking to someone like that because their mind is so within the institution. And even though this guy, you know, let's face it, he was in the army. I doubt he's going to be right on, you know, like a social worker on all these touchy feely issues. But the fact is, being part of the police is his whole identity. Is being in the institution. So any disagreement he has with political correctness, he just puts it to the side of his mind or the back of his mind. He's like a normie drone, a normie robot. And again, this isn't because he's a bad person. I mean, not everyone can be a conviction person. You this is the institutional mentality. I mean, the best one I ever heard, because it can even go beyond financial success, because the best one I heard, it was a guy on another team. I didn't know him very well. It was an older guy, and he'd been a police response driver for years and years. And that means you've passed the course where you can drive a car on blue lights, so you can go through red lights, you can drive without the speed limit, because I grade emergency calls, you have to get there, you aim to get an I grade within 15 minutes, an S grade you aim to get there within an hour, and a referred grade you've got 24 hours. So, you know, see, an I grade would be someone's trying to murder me, an S grade would be, oh, we've got a shoplifter here, and a referred grade would be someone's vandalised my fence in the night. So, you know, obviously the 999 call centre will prioritise and see what's what, and allocate a grade to each call. Well, there was this old guy, and he looked quite old. He must have been in his 50s. And I don't know whether it was inside work or outside work, that he'd had some sort of blackout while he was driving, and he'd had a minor prang. And they said to him, well, you can't obviously be an I grade response driver anymore because you've had a blackout while you're driving. And so when he got better, he was like, oh no, it's cured now, I can drive again. And they're like, well, no, because you've had this blackout. And this guy, he'd been an I grade driver for at least 10 years, so he'd done it. You know, he'd achieved it. Why did he need to continue with it? But what he did, I mean, bear in mind, policemen, I mean, my pay was about 2,100 a month take home. And even people who've been in years and years, I think once the pension's taken out, they're only on about 2,400 a month. So what he did, so he could stay as an I grade driver, this guy of 50 odd, he went and he paid the top brain surgeon in Harley Street in the entire country £4,000, because I don't think the Federation would pay it, to do a scan of his brain to prove he'd never have any blackouts again and he was totally cured, so he could stay as an I grade driver. And you look at it and you think, the guy's getting paid £2,000 a month and he's prepared to spend £4,000 on a Harley Street specialist just so he can stay driving a car on blue lights when he's already done it for years. And part of this is that their whole identity with these people is tied up in the institution. Their identity is being a policeman, being a soldier, being a KGB agent. And Putin, he's from that school of thought, I would think. When I look at him, when I see him, he reminds me of that sort of very much a pragmatic person. He may have a vague set of core beliefs, but he isn't someone like us in the movement who is driven by conviction. There's no grand plan. There's no grand aim. And I think also if you look at Putin, so Putin is very much like the guy going for great brain scans so he can stay as a response driver. It's very much part of his identity is being a KGB agent, and it's very much that someone in disfavour, he'd have probably done a Rachel and not spoken to them the minute they're in trouble, because he's very much, the institution is part of him. It's part of his identity. And when you look at his KGB career, it wasn't actually that good. It was quite a mundane career. He used to do debriefings on people who'd been abroad, and I think he was in East Germany, and there was never any sort of James Bond style action. And so with people like Andropov, who did have a stellar career, he idolises them because they were what he wanted to be, and he never quite got there. And I think maybe part of this briggadoccio as the Russian president, the tough guy, is a compensation that he never did have that stellar career. He was very much a mundane, run-of-the-mill, no massive heroics type agent. But you look at him, his whole identity is wrapped up in that identity of being that KGB agent, and that is the type of person I would say that he is. Now, so this is the type of person we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a person who's got a grand conviction, and we're dealing with a person who's motivated, institution type person, a pragmatist, and we're dealing with someone who probably likes money and likes luxury. So there would never have been 5 years ago in his mind a grand plan to conquer Ukraine. Now, you can go against viewers of my video, 2 of you, or however many there are. You can go against my argument, but you can say, but not every person in an institution is like this, because conviction people have served in institutions, because obviously Hitler was a soldier in the 16th Bavarian Infantry Regiment in the First World War. Enoch Powell went from being a private to a brigadier in the Second World War. Both very much conviction driven people, to the extent of their own career, their own survival, they would put aside for their conviction. Now, that was in a different time, because that was a time of mass conscription. So this is what you've got to remember. Putin, he wasn't conscripted into the KGB. He was desperate to get in there. It was very much like the police today, like the army today. There's a selection process, and you have to pass, and you have to get in there, and you have to, I mean, the police was 3 exams on law at 70%, and learning 30 pages on law by heart, and you take a pride in it. And stuff like having CS spray sprayed in your face and passing a control and restraint course and a handcuff test. So Putin is very much an institutional man, and we're not in the age of mass conscription where everyone, even the characters, even the conviction-driven people like Enoch Powell, like Hitler, will be in the institution. Institutions today will be very much your normie conformist. And this is what Putin is. He has a vague belief in Mother Russia, a vague desire to see Russia powerful, but he's not got a big plan, a big master plan. So he's a pragmatist. But the thing is, he's gone in to Ukraine and he's expected an instant success like he had in Crimea. He thought he'd roll in there and he'd sort the government, but there's been such a swell of support for Ukraine and such a swell of resistance among the Ukrainian people that things haven't gone to plan. And maybe it's got very much that as he's got more and more powerful, he's isolated himself, he's surrounded himself with yes men. I mean, if in the face of NATO provocation, he'd the 2 eastern provinces, which are overwhelmingly ethnic Russian, he'd taken them back and integrated them into Russia, uh, you know, that would have been a proportionate, pragmatic response. But I think he's got, with age and with this awareness that he wants to make his mark on history before he leaves office, this normally pragmatic guy, a normie institution type guy, motivated by money and career, has decided to try and bite off a little bit more. And the thing is, now the West is foolishly up in the ante. So it's very much like the guy started off as a pragmatist, but he's getting less and less avenues of exit, and this is where things get really dangerous, because I mean, you look at Germany in World War II in 1943, and it's, you know, why did they keep fighting? And Albert Speer, he Spandau Diaries. There's a part in this, I can't remember exactly where it is, and he reminisces when he's writing in jail upon conversations with Hitler. And he said there was a point in 1943 in a conference, where a military conference with Hitler, where they're all arguing over the latest crisis and arguing and in despair and didn't know what to do, and then Hitler just said in a very low voice, "We've burnt our bridges now, gentlemen. We can't go back." And this is the worry for Putin, even though he's begun as a pragmatist, as a normie institutional drone, like the people I've worked with, even though he's begun like that, if you leave him less and less avenues of exit by cutting off all Russia's trade, by cutting Russia out of the financial system, you know, by confiscating oligarchs' stuff abroad, by saying that the Baltic is, like Anthony Blinken said, we're going to defend every inch of NATO territory. So the Baltic may well be the new flashpoint once Ukraine's over. But you've got a guy who started out. He's been provoked. He started out as a normie institutional drone from the KGB, as someone who's into money and career, and conviction isn't up front like it is for us in the movement. Conviction's maybe third or fourth. And now he's being pushed by events as the whole world turns on Russia, as the whole world cuts them off. I mean, you can't send a UPS package there, you can't fly there. I think there's 21,000 Russian tourists stranded abroad. You can't use a Visa card there. That Germany's not going to buy their oil, and part of this is that when you push people more and more, they're more likely to become the death or glory conviction type politician. So when you go back to the quote that I started with earlier, Mark Galeotti, the Putin expert, who said that he's a strategic mastermind and people are looking for a grand design that isn't there. Well, he's almost being pushed by all this liberal globalist opposition into having this grand plan, into being a Hitler or a Stalin with a fixation and a goal, and they're willing to go for that goal no matter how much blood, how much cost there is. And I mean once they start confiscating oligarchs' money, because Putin has got a lot of his support from oligarchs like Abramovich, then you're really looking at quite a dangerous situation for him personally, because they're the ones who've got the power to try and organise some sort of palace coup against him. And I mean, the type of money you're talking about, it's a whole different world. I mean, I remember when I was a policeman, I was called to this building and they said, oh, the alarm had gone off, so we had to go up with the caretaker and just have a look inside, and it was right near Whitehall in the Ministry of Defence, and it was a Russian oligarch who was a friend of Putin, and it was his flat, and we went up there, and the wealth and the splendour, it was like a different world in this flat. It was the living room was the same size as a tennis court. There was a grand piano, there was a massive widescreen TV, there was antique furniture, and the concierge, he told us, oh, the guy who owns this flat, he's a billionaire oligarch friend of Putin, he hasn't even been here for 4 years. So he's got a flat that must cost thousands to maintain and keep, filled with every conceivable luxury and pleasure, and he's not even been there for 4 years because he's got 10 others like it. He said, oh, his wife comes in the spring because she takes her dogs to Crufts, but even his wife only comes about once or twice a year. So this is the sort of money that's there, and the liberal globalists, by cutting off this money from these people, they, I mean, I remember when apartheid South Africa ended in 1990 and Nelson Mandela came to power, they went and they filmed Eugene Terre Blanche, and he said to the camera, he said, and the one thing that we're going to defend in this country is private property. And everyone looked at him like he's mad. Like, what, we're going to have this lovely, cosy rainbow republic, all races are equal. And there was Terre Blanche saying private property. And we may well see this happen in South Africa. We've seen it in Zimbabwe with white farms being confiscated. And this is, again, part of the problem. That the left, they don't have respect for things like private property. And it's all very well saying, oh, this oligarch's a friend of Putin, he's got billions of pounds, but you can't take a man's money without, real judicial proof that it's been earned dishonestly. And all the forms and all the legal proof for where that money has been earned will be abroad, so they won't be able to access it. So if you get to the point where private property is being confiscated without good grounds, without proper legal proof, then you create chaos. And this is what Terre Blanche was predicting. The chaos of South Africa today, with the crime endemic, with the farmers being murdered, he predicted that back in 1990 because he knew where it'd go. Because the left, at their base, they don't respect private property. They don't respect that humans are different. They will achieve different things. They will have different levels of possession and attainment. And with this mentality that they're coming at Putin with, if they don't respect private property, again, you're going to have chaos. And you're creating chaos in a nuclear power where there is the potential to destroy the world, and it's basically insanity. I mean, if Putin is thrown aside by the oligarchs or by generals because of the Western economic pressure, who's to say that the person who succeeds him won't be even worse? I mean, the fact is, if they have to pull out of Ukraine and go back to where they were 2 weeks ago, then it's almost like saying that all those Russian soldiers, and there's already 500 been killed, have died for nothing. And if you read history, Barbarossa in that book, after the conclusion of Stalingrad, via the Swedes, the Russians did actually offer the Germans peace based on everyone returning to where the borders were on June the 21st, 1941. But Hitler couldn't take it because if Hitler took that deal, he has to then admit, oh, I've just sacrificed 1 million German soldiers for nothing. And then his position maybe becomes untenable. So even if Putin is got rid of, you, the person who comes to power, if for them to pull Russian troops out, they're more or less saying all the Russian troops who died before died in vain. And that's a very hard thing for any leader to do. I mean, it's very much like the Falkland Islands. Now, if there'd been no Falklands War, I mean, a few years ago, Argentina offered every Falkland Islander, I think it was about £200,000 to vote to become Argentinian, and they said no, and they're going to say no because 250 odd British soldiers died fighting in a war to keep the Falklands British in 1982. So no British Prime Minister could now ever give away those islands or reach some sort of deal with Argentina on those islands. Now, if there hadn't been a war, the Argentina might well have been able to say, oh, Falkland Islanders, here's £200,000 each, and they'd vote to become Argentine. But it's never going to happen now because men have died. And once men have died, once you've gone down this path, it becomes very hard to go back. And this is the thing. As I've said about Putin, I've analysed who he is and where he comes from. He's very much a pragmatic, response to events politician, a Boris Johnson, no deep conviction, no deep master plan. But now he's in this hole where men have died and where he's stuck in a quagmire. It's very hard to go back now. He's burnt the bridges, and I see. I mean, I myself, I wouldn't even like to predict an outcome because it's just very, very bad. But as Marx says of Eyesight, Putin is to blame now because he's continuing a criminal war, killing Slav brothers. But the fact is, he was partly provoked into this war, and when you do things like the Western leaders are saying, oh, war crimes, and he's going to be in a jail cell in The Hague, they're up in the ante, and they're forcing him down into this conviction, death or glory route, and this is where it's headed. And that's all I've got to say on it. That's my viewpoint on it. I mean, may not be profound, but I think it's important all of us in the movement put our views out there so we can discuss and come up with a common approach to this, and maybe point out an alternative. And maybe if there is a way out, it's probably going to come from a suggestion we make rather than a suggestion that the liberal fools who started this war and provoked this tiger are going to do. So, as I say, my best wishes to anyone in Ukraine, my prayers for them, and my prayers for any poor Slavic person who's been killed in this tragic brothers' war. And it didn't need to happen, and it shouldn't have happened. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time.